Human history has had plenty of ups and downs. For every great triumph there has been great disaster. History is not necessarily linear, with things getting better all the time. What makes for the worst year in history? It is harder to determine than you might expect. You might think the worst year in history is the one with the most deaths, but that doesn't really narrow things down. Determining the worst year in history is pretty complicated, and it turns out that picking the worst is pretty subjective. Is it the year with the most widespread suffering? The years that saw terrible turning points for the world, or something else? Some years were certainly worse than others. Some were standalone bad years. 12 months in which it all seemed to go wrong for humanity. Other bad years were simply nadirs set within a longer period of misery. The worst years of famines or wars or genocide. Of course, the question of what actually was the worst year in all of human history is one that is constantly up for debate. Indeed, there really is no right or wrong answer. No matter what some historians might say. Depending on the scale of an event, it could affect globally, like the outbreak of COVID that has made 2020 a dreadful year, or it only affects at a specific geographic location, like during Mao Zedong's rule. China suffered what is known as the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961, in which an estimated 15 to 55 million died. The major contributing factors in the famine were the policies of the Great Leap Forward and people's communes, in addition to some natural disasters such as droughts, which took place during the period, making those times the worst years to be alive. 2020 was terrible, no doubt about it. The most developed economies destroyed, unemployment skyrocketed, travel restrictions, social distancing, and millions of lives claimed by the COVID-19 has made this year for many as the worst year that the human race has witnessed as far as their memories go. But this hasn't been the only worst year we have known. History tells us about more such horrible years. The 6th century was a pretty grim time to be alive. This period, referred to as the Dark Ages, the year 536, was the darker and the worst of the worst. Scientists have shown that a huge volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, but perhaps in El Salvador, caused temperatures to plummet as ash blocked out sunlight for most of the year. Across Europe, the Middle East, and large parts of Asia, people were plunged into darkness. As if freezing temperatures, a lack of sunlight, and the total failure of crops wasn't enough, large parts of the world were also engulfed by war. Both halves of the Roman Empire had finally fallen, leaving chaos and uncertainty in their wake. It is believed that there were other large volcanic eruptions in 540. People were still struggling in 542, and that is when the bubonic plague, aka Justinian plague, decided to take advantage of an already weakened world population. Halfway through his reign, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I fell seriously ill. He pulled through and went on to stay in power for another decade. However, many of his citizens were not so lucky. Indeed, the plague that ravaged large parts of the world between 541 and 542 led to an estimated 25 to 50 million deaths. Around a quarter of the world's population was wiped out in the space of 2 years. 5,000 people a day were perishing in Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Roman Empire. The Justinian plague not only killed millions, it also led to a massive spike in grain prices, causing huge numbers of people to go hungry. It wasn't until 575 that things started looking a little better. The Great Famine, as 1314 later came to be called, impacted around 30 million people across much of Europe, with areas like Britain and Scandinavian particularly hard hit. Thanks to the addition of wars and revolts, things really started going bad in the summer of 1314. That is when it rained almost constantly, and the ensuing floods ruined crops, wild food rotted in the fields, livestock had it just as bad, animals starved or drowned in the floods. As food stores emptied and prices skyrocketed, famine set in, as even basics like wheat and salt were impossible to get. The flooding was so bad that rising seas swallowed entire coastal communities, sending newly homeless people further inland to already strained communities. By the winter of 1315, farmers were forced to eat their seed stocks to make it through the cold months. The year 1316 stands out due to the extra grimness. Especially in England, the harvests had failed. In 1315, this happened again the following year, causing widespread hunger. Countless numbers starved as it carried on raining right across Europe, preventing new crops from being grown and harvested. Even King Edward II of England found no bread to eat when he arrived into the city of St. Albans that summer. Many of the surviving sources from the time note that many peasants turned to cannibalism and families would abandon their children to look after themselves, a brutal turn of events that inspired the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. Eventually, the weather returned to normal in the summer of 1317. Having originated in China and Inner Asia, the Black Death decimated the armies of Kipchak Khan Janabeg while he was besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea with his forces. Disintegrating Janabeg catapulted plague-infested corpses into the town in an effort to infect his enemies. From Kaffa, Genoese ships carried the epidemic westward to Mediterranean ports, from where it spread inland, affecting North Africa and Europe. At the start of 1347, things got really bad with the arrival of a second strain. In January 1348, estimates on the total number of casualties vary. However, most guesses put the total number of victims at 200 million, meaning as much as 60% of Europe's population was wiped out in a few months. According to one contemporary quip, victims would enjoy lunch with their friends at home and then dinner with their ancestors in heaven. Such was the speed with which it killed. The Black Death didn't just have a physical impact. The psychological burden was huge too. People living past the year 1347 were scarred for life. Doommongers and religious leaders blamed the plague on a loss of faith. 1492 was a catastrophic year, as Columbus and his men brought old world diseases to the new world. The native people were helpless and died by the millions. It is believed that 1492 marked the beginning of the end for many indigenous people. Between then and the start of the 6th century, 90% of the indigenous population was wiped out, with many cultures lost for good. As if that is not bad enough, back home in Europe, Columbus's sponsors, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, conquered Moorish Granada in 1492. After that, they would kill, enslave, or expel some 500,000 Muslims in Spain. For the Spanish conquistadors, the year 520 was one of triumph for the native inhabitants of modern-day Mexico. However, this was a very dark year due to the chaos and misery it led to. By this point, Hernan Cortés has already been in the Americas for a year. However, in April 1520, another group of Spaniards arrived into Veracruz, fresh from Hispaniola, bringing smallpox with them. Cortés defeated these newcomers, but one of his men contracted the disease. This meant it was brought right into the heart of the Aztec Empire. In his journals, the Spanish monk Motolinia recalled, as the Indians did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps like bedbugs between 1520 and 1521. Smallpox killed millions of native inhabitants of this part of America. Between 60 to 90% of the people are believed to have been killed. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, inevitably Cortés was able to defeat the Aztecs with ease. The Incas shared the same fate, with smallpox doing more damage than muskets ever could. Spanish soldiers stationed in the Belgian city of Antwerp. The men were far from home, fighting against the Dutch in the name of Spanish king. However, they hadn't been paid for months. In November of 1576, they snapped and went on a rampage. For 3 days, they killed large numbers of citizens. It is believed that as many as 7,000 people died, many of them thrown into canals or simply chopped down with swords. The events of the day led to a Europe-wide economic crisis. Antwerp ceased to be a major trading power, allowing Amsterdam to rise up. Spanish troops and Spanish people were henceforth portrayed as ruthless savages. This leyenda negra, or black legend, was to endure for centuries, shaping Spanish history, both at home and abroad. 1576 was a truly terrible year. It also marked the rise of the Holy League in neighboring France and condemned much of Europe to a period of poverty, uncertainty, and widespread violence. In 1601, a volcanic eruption in Peru led to millions of people starving in Russia and many more enduring a summer with no sunlight. While the exact number of fatalities will never be known, it is believed as many as 2 million people starved to death, many of them during the first year of the disaster. This meant around 1 in 3 Russians died in the space of just 2 or 3 years. Moreover, the famine led to serious social and political disruption, including the downfall of Boris Godunov, who had declared himself Tsar of all Russia. The effects of the eruption of a volcano in Peru in 1600 were felt the world over. Sunlight levels fell globally, hitting harvests in countries including France, Switzerland, Japan and China. The records show that 127,000 people were buried in a mass grave in Moscow between 1601 and 1602. There were also stories of people killing their pets in order to eat them and wear their furs, plus the inevitable tales of people becoming cannibals in order to stay alive. It started in June 1783, the eruption of Iceland's Laki volcano. The eruption lasted for shocking 8 months, and at the time the world also experienced a surprisingly warm summer. But the hot summer wasn't the biggest problem or the result of the volcanic eruption. Rather, it was the unexpectedly cold winter that followed. The volcano unleashed an insane amount of unpleasantness into the air. For most of 1783, the air over the northern hemisphere was filled with a sulfuric aerosol cloud, which caused the world smell like rotten eggs, and breathing gave people all kinds of respiratory problems. There was ton of acid rain too. Within the year, more than half of Iceland's livestock were dead, along with 20% of their population. Thanks to El Niño and the fallout of the Icelandic volcanoes, large parts of the northern hemisphere didn't experience a real summer in 1783. Alaska, for instance, endured its coldest year in 4 centuries. Fortunately, few people were living there. That wasn't the case in heavily populated northern India. An estimated 11 million people starved to death between 1783 and 1784 in what's now known as the Chalisa famine. The Delhi region experienced huge losses. According to some estimates, 1 in 3 villages were completely wiped out. The following year was then unseasonably hot. The presence of such large amounts of sulfur dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere meant that the vital monsoon rains never came. Soaring temperatures across northern India meant that rivers and lakes dried up, making matters even worse. It would be 2 long years until the Indian climate returned to normal. Deaths due to respiratory failure skyrocketed. The effects were far-reaching and long-lasting. Ships were stuck in ports, trade stopped, crops died in the fields, and meat spoiled as soon as it was slaughtered. That ultra-hot summer gave way to an ultra-cold winter, and famine was widespread. More people died, and more than that, famine in Europe was so bad it was linked to causing 1789's French Revolution. 1816 came to be known as the year without a summer, as volcanic ash covered skies around the world, bringing misery and starvation to millions of people at the time. It appeared like the world was coming to an end in Europe as well as in North America. Snowfall during June and temperatures fell below freezing in July. The skies remained almost permanently dark and crops failed, leading to famine and unrest. The reason: in April of 1816, Mount Tambora, a huge volcano in Indonesia, erupted, spouting millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. The effects were felt the world over, as if the unseasonable weather and the near constant darkness wasn't enough. As global temperatures dropped by as much as 3 degrees, a number of diseases started to break break out, countless numbers decided to pack up and move in the hope of escaping the impending apocalypse. At least 12,000 Indonesians had no chance of moving since they were killed outright by the volcano's eruption. At the same time, however, many people stayed put and either prayed or found inspiration. Famously, Mary Shelley was moved to write her famous Gothic tale, Frankenstein, thanks to the year with no summer. Unrest had been boiling for a long time. The 1840s saw Europe dropping into an economic crisis that hit the rural and urban poor the hardest. Liberal thinkers started demanding things like religious liberties and parliamentary rule. Then they did more than talk. During the spring and summer of 1848, the people of Europe rose up. The year came to be known as the Year of Revolution, with movements demanding change in numerous countries, most notably in France. The states that would become Germany, Denmark, and Austria and Hungary. The records show that 50 different nations were affected by unrest. Tens of thousands of people were killed as the streets of Europe's historic capitals flowed with blood. While the streets of Europe dissolved into violent, bloody clashes between rebels and the military, the old order stepped up, took control back, and not a whole lot got accomplished. 1848's heated rebellions amounted to a downright miserable year of largely pointless violence. Whether it was all worth the sacrifice remains the source of much historical debate. The heightened nationalism would bubble under for decades to come, eventually being unleashed with a vengeance during the First World War. Indeed, one of the main consequences of the 1848 uprisings was the foundation of the powerful German Confederation. 1848 also represented the height of the Irish famine, which left hundreds of thousands dead and caused many millions to leave their homeland for good. 1919 may have brought peace, but millions died from Spanish flu. The peace treaty that officially ended the slaughter should have ushered in a century of peace. However, the Treaty of Versailles did quite the opposite. The end of the war came as a shock to many people in Germany, as did the idea that their nation was actually the loser. This single document planted the seeds for the Second World War, with Hitler able to take advantage of the widespread mistrust of politicians, resentment, and thirst for revenge. 1919 also saw Russia descending into its own bloody civil war, a conflict that would lead to the creation of communist Soviet Union. The end of the First World War also led to the maps of the Middle East being redrawn, creating grievances that are still fought over to this day. Though at its peak in 1918, Spanish flu killed millions in 1919, an estimated 500,000 Americans died as a result of the epidemic during those 12 months alone, and those who survived were unable to toast their good luck. After all, the 18th Amendment, which introduced prohibition, was passed in 1919. There really were no good years between the start of the Second World War in 1939 and its conclusion in 1945, but 1943 was arguably the worst of the lot, as Winston Churchill was becoming the figurehead of the righteous Allied advance. He was also doing something horrible in India. Britain increased the volume of food it took from its Indian colonies, with around 3 million then dying of starvation in the Bengal province. the first 2 decades of 21st century were not so uneventful. The aftermath of 9/11 brought the death and destruction of so-called the war on terrorism on Afghanistan and Iraq that resulted in the loss of thousands of innocent lives. Asia suffered 2 devastating natural disasters back to back. The Arab Spring brought nothing but turmoil in the Middle East. The uprisings resulted in bloody civil war. In some countries, Syria and Yemen are still suffering, and the region on the whole has no spring of peace and stability in sight. No one could really predict how our next year, month, or week will be. We can only hope for the best. Stay safe.